January 1944. Deep inside the headquarters of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht in East Prussia, map tables stretched beneath dim lamps. The Atlantic Ocean covered an entire wall. Thin red pins marked known U-boat patrol lines. Blue markers, newly added, clustered along the British coastline. The numbers had arrived that morning. Railway clerks in occupied France had reported increased Allied air traffic. Naval intelligence from Brest spoke of convoy sightings beyond previous estimates. Reconnaissance suggested the ports of Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow were overflowing. Another American convoy had arrived. Then another, and another. By early 1944, German analysts estimated that well over 1.5 million U.S. troops were already in Britain. The reports projected something larger, something industrial, relentless. Berlin had expected shipments. It had expected reinforcements. It had not expected an ocean bridge. What troubled the German command was not a single fleet, nor a single landing, but the realization that the Atlantic, once considered a barrier. December 11, 1941. For days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States. It was a decision rooted in confidence. German leadership believed America was unprepared for continental war. Its army ranked far below European standards in 1939. Its public had been divided. Its industry, though vast, was not yet mobilized for total conflict. Many within the German high command assumed that if the United States entered the war, it would require years to raise, train, equip, and transport a modern expeditionary force across an ocean dominated by German submarines. The Atlantic was considered Germany's strategic shield. Since 1939, Admiral Karl Donitz had expanded the U-boat arm into a lethal instrument. By early 1942, during what American sailors later called the Second Happy Time, German submarines operated aggressively along the U.S. East Coast and in the Caribbean. Tankers burned within sight of American beaches. Merchant ships sailed without convoy protection. Harbor lights remained on at night, silhouetting vessels for torpedo attack. Between January and August 1942, hundreds of Allied ships were sunk. Tonnage losses climbed faster than replacement rates. German commanders believed the math was clear. If shipping could be destroyed faster than it could be built, Britain would starve and any American buildup would collapse before it began. At that stage of the war, the United States Army was still mobilizing. The selective service system expanded rapidly. Training camps filled across the Midwest and South. Factories that had produced automobiles and refrigerators shifted toward tanks, artillery, and aircraft. But mobilization on land was only part of the equation. To fight Germany directly, American soldiers would have to cross 3,000 miles of contested ocean. Every rifleman required transport space. Every division required tens of thousands of tons of equipment, vehicles, ammunition, rations, fuel, medical supplies. A single infantry division could require more than 15,000 men and thousands of vehicles. An armored division demanded even more shipping space. Germany's naval leadership believed such a movement was unsustainable under submarine pressure. In early 1942, U-boat commanders reported exceptional success. Operation Paukenschlag, the drumbeat, struck shipping lanes with devastating results. Merchant captains described torpedoes arriving without warning. Lifeboats drifted in winter seas. Oil slicks stretched for miles. Berlin interpreted these reports as confirmation of strategic foresight. If the Atlantic could be sealed, America would remain a distant arsenal, powerful, but unable to deliver force at decisive scale. Meanwhile, Britain remained under strain. The Battle of the Atlantic had already consumed enormous resources. Escort destroyers were limited. Long-range aircraft coverage left dangerous air gaps in mid-ocean where convoys sailed beyond detective range. In those gaps, wolf packs formed at night. Yet even in 1942, the first signs of imbalance began to appear. American shipyards accelerated production. Convoy systems improved. Coastal blackouts were enforced. New escort vessels were commissioned at unprecedented speed. But from Berlin's vantage point, those developments seemed incremental, not transformative. German intelligence assessed American troop movements cautiously. Early deployments were modest. In 1942, the United States focused on North Africa. Operation Torch required significant transport, yet it remained geographically closer to American supply lines through the Atlantic southern routes. The idea that millions of American troops could gather in Britain for a direct assault on Western Europe still appeared distant. German planners focused instead on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was deeply engaged against the Soviet Union. Resources were allocated accordingly. Submarine production increased, but surface fleet expansion stagnated. The belief persisted that U-boats alone could strangle Allied logistics. What Berlin did not yet fully comprehend was the scale of American industrial conversion already underway, and how rapidly that conversion would change the balance of tonnage on the Atlantic. By late 1942, the contest at sea was no longer a one-sided hunt. It was becoming a race of production, technology, and endurance, a race that would determine whether the ocean remained a German weapon or became an Allied bridge. And as that race intensified, the foundations of Germany's Atlantic strategy began to. By 1943, the character of the Atlantic War had changed. In American shipyards from Maine to California, hulls slid into the water at a pace never before recorded in maritime history. The standardized Liberty ship, simple, functional, welded rather than riveted, could be assembled in weeks. Some yards reduced construction time to mere days for demonstration launches. Quantity replaced elegance. Reliability replaced perfection. In 1941, the United States had produced fewer than 2 million tons of merchant shipping. By 1943, annual output exceeded 18 million tons. Ship losses continued, but replacement now outpaced destruction. For Admiral Karl Donitz, the arithmetic was shifting in dangerous ways. Convoys grew larger and more organized. Escort groups were no longer temporary attachments, but trained, coordinated units. Destroyer escorts, corvettes, and frigates surrounded merchant columns in layered defense. Most critically, technology matured. High-frequency direction finding, HFDUF, allowed Allied ships to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions. Airborne radar extended patrol visibility beyond the horizon. Long-range aircraft such as the B-24 Liberator closed a mid-Atlantic air gap that had once provided sanctuary to submarine wolf packs. Escort carriers, small and utilitarian, projected fighter cover into waters previously uncontested. In May 1943, the turning point became unmistakable. That month, U-boat losses spiked dramatically. Dozens were destroyed in coordinated air-sea operations. For the first time, German submariners faced an environment where hunting convoys meant near-certain detection. Donitz temporarily withdrew many boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging that the balance had turned. This transformation at sea carried consequences far beyond tonnage statistics. It enabled Operation Bolero. Operation Bolero was a code name for the systematic buildup of American forces in the United Kingdom in preparation for a cross-channel invasion. Beginning in 1942 and accelerating through 1943, American troop transports arrived in British ports in steady waves. Not dramatic landings, not single decisive armadas, but disciplined, scheduled movement month after month. By the end of 1942, roughly 400,000 American troops were stationed in Britain. In 1943, that number climbed sharply. Ports were expanded. Airfields multiplied across English countryside. Storage depots filled with fuel drums, ammunition crates, spare engines, and prefabricated bridge components. Entire American divisions disembarked and moved inland with methodical precision. Infantry trained on British moors. Armored units rehearsed embarkation drills. Engineers studied French tidal charts. Each soldier represented shipping capacity secured. Each tank unloaded from a transport represented Atlantic control sustained. German intelligence observed fragments of this buildup. Aerial reconnaissance detected increased airfield construction. Signals intercept suggested rising American presence. Reports from occupied France noted intensified Allied bombing aimed at transportation networks, a preparatory pattern. Yet the cumulative scale remained difficult for Berlin to fully quantify. The numbers were staggering. Between 1942 and mid-1944, more than 2.5 million American service members were transported across the Atlantic to the European theater. This figure included not only combat troops, but engineers, logistics personnel, medical units, air crews, and naval support staff. Alongside them came millions of tons of equipment: trucks, jeeps, Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, aircraft components, rations, fuel, and ammunition. And unlike earlier expeditionary forces in history, these troops were not isolated from reinforcement. The flow did not stop. It accelerated. By early 1944, American divisions in Britain were fully equipped and integrated into a vast Allied command structure under General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Shipping schedules were calculated with industrial precision. Convoys departed on fixed rotations. Replacement drafts filled training camps continuously. For Germany, the Atlantic was no longer a contested gamble. It was becoming an uncontested corridor. The U-boat fleet still operated, but strategic impact had diminished. Losses could no longer offset Allied production. Technological surprise had faded. The element of invisibility was gone. What German planners had once considered an impenetrable moat was now functioning as a reinforced bridge, carrying an army measured not in divisions alone, but in millions. And with that realization came a deeper concern. If America could sustain such movement without interruption, then any future invasion of Western Europe would not be a raid or demonstration. In 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt described the United States as an arsenal of democracy. By 1943, the phrase had become measurable reality. American industrial production did not merely expand. It reorganized itself around war. Automobile factories in Detroit shifted from civilian vehicles to tanks and aircraft engines. Steel output surged. Aluminum production multiplied. Shipyards adopted assembly line techniques previously reserved for consumer goods. The Liberty ship symbolized this transformation. Built from standardized components, welded in sections, and launched with minimal customization, it sacrificed aesthetic refinement for speed and durability. Shipyards such as Kaiser's facilities in Richmond, California, reduced construction time to astonishing levels. What had once taken months now required weeks. But ships alone were not decisive. The United States also produced trucks in vast numbers, over 800,000 during the war. These vehicles would later sustain armies across France and Germany. Aircraft production reached tens of thousands annually. By 1944, American factories were outproducing Axis powers combined in several major categories. For German planners accustomed to finite replacement cycles, this scale defied traditional military logic. Equipment losses that might cripple another nation were absorbed and replaced with minimal interruption. The Atlantic crossing of 2.5 million troops was not an isolated achievement. It was a visible extension of an industrial engine that did not pause, did not ration itself defensively, and did not slow under pressure. At the war's outset, German U-boats relied on stealth, coordinated attacks, and radio-directed wolfpack tactics. In 1942, these methods yielded extraordinary results. By 1943, they faced a transformed battle space. Allied convoys were no longer loosely guarded merchant groups. They became integrated defensive formations. Escort vessels trained together for extended deployments, sharing sonar data and coordinated attack patterns. When a submarine was detected, surface ships held contact, while aircraft were summoned to deliver depth charges or bombs. Escort carriers extended air coverage into mid-ocean. These compact carriers were not built for fleet engagements. They existed solely to protect convoys. Their aircraft hunted submarines relentlessly, reducing the safe operating zones U-boats had once exploited. Technological improvements further narrowed German advantage. Centimetric radar could detect periscopes and snorkels. Improved depth charges detonated at precise depths. Acoustic homing torpedoes were countered with noise-generating decoys. By May 1943, the cumulative effect forced Admiral Karl Donitz to reassess deployment strategy. Loss rates became unsustainable. Crews once confident in night surface attacks now faced radar-guided interception. The Atlantic had shifted from Predator's ground to monitored corridor. This security at sea allowed troop convoys to maintain regularity. Sailing schedules stabilized. Risk calculations changed. The possibility of transporting entire divisions without catastrophic loss became realistic and then routine. Behind tonnage figures were individuals. American soldiers boarding transports in New York or Norfolk carried field packs and sealed orders. Many had trained for months without knowing their final destination. Convoy secrecy was strict. Ships zigzagged across the Atlantic to avoid submarine detection. Life aboard transport vessels was crowded, structured, and disciplined. Troops slept in tiered bunks stacked tightly in converted liners and troop ships. Lifeboat drills were mandatory. Blackout conditions were enforced at night. Chaplains conducted services in cramped holds. Letters home were censored for operational security. Yet morale often remained steady. For many soldiers, crossing the Atlantic represented tangible commitment. They were no longer preparing for war. They were entering it. British civilians greeted arriving Americans with curiosity and relief. Shared rations and cultural exchanges softened the austerity of wartime Britain. By early 1944, American presence in the United Kingdom was visible everywhere. Airfields dotted southern England. Military convoys moved along narrow roads. Depots stored fuel and ammunition in staggering quantities. The movement of 2.5 million troops was not a single convoy but a continuous procession, structured, protected, and timed with industrial precision. And as that procession continued without decisive interruption, German command assessments began to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. When Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, he did so under several assumptions. First, that America's military mobilization would be slow and politically constrained. Second, that the Atlantic submarine campaign would severely limit any large-scale troop transfer. Third, that Germany's primary struggle remained in the East against the Soviet Union, and that resources must be concentrated there. In 1942, these assumptions appeared defensible. U-boat successes were real. American ground forces were inexperienced. Britain remained under strain. But German high command assessments underestimated one factor: compounding production. American industrial capacity did not simply expand linearly, it multiplied. Ship losses that seemed decisive in early 1942 became statistically absorbable by late 1943. Troop deployments that once required cautious calculation became scheduled routines. Meanwhile, German strategy remained divided. The Eastern Front consumed manpower and material at extraordinary rates. North Africa demanded reinforcement. The Luftwaffe struggled to defend the Reich from strategic bombing. No single branch could be strengthened sufficiently to reverse Atlantic decline. By early 1944, reports estimating more than 1.5 million American troops in Britain began circulating within OKW briefings. The scale contradicted earlier expectations. The submarine arm had failed to prevent concentration. The Atlantic barrier had not held. The miscalculation was no longer theoretical. It was numerical. The success of transatlantic movement was not based on production alone. It relied on information control. Allied code-breaking efforts under Ultra provided critical insights into German naval deployments. Intercepted communications allowed convoy routes to avoid concentrated wolfpack zones. When submarines massed in specific sectors, shipping lanes shifted accordingly. German intelligence, by contrast, faced fragmentation. Reconnaissance flights over Britain were limited by air defenses. Human intelligence networks struggled to measure troop totals accurately. Estimates varied, and confirmation was difficult. Simultaneously, Allied deception operations amplified uncertainty. As Operation Bolero transitioned toward invasion planning, elaborate misinformation campaigns suggested possible landings in Norway or the Pas-de-Calais. Inflatable tanks, false radio traffic, and controlled leaks reinforced the illusion of dispersed Allied strength. German analysts could detect increased American presence in Britain. What they could not reliably determine was timing, concentration point, or scale of immediate intent. This ambiguity deepened strategic strain. If millions of American troops were already in theater and more continued to arrive, then any delay in German defensive preparation risked catastrophe. Yet dispersing forces too broadly invited weakness elsewhere. The flow across the Atlantic thus achieved more than transportation. It created operational pressure through uncertainty. By early 1944, the German public was experiencing sustained Allied bombing. Cities such as Hamburg and Berlin endured repeated air raids. Industrial production faced disruption. Civilian morale fluctuated under strain. Within this context, intelligence briefings about American troop numbers carried symbolic weight. Germany had entered the war believing in qualitative superiority, in training, doctrine, and tactical innovation. Blitzkrieg had demonstrated speed and coordination. Early victories reinforced belief in operational brilliance over raw quantity. But the American buildup represented quantity on a scale difficult to reconcile. Reports suggesting that over 2 million U.S. troops had already crossed the Atlantic signaled something deeper than an impending invasion. They signaled endurance, replacement capacity, sustained escalation. German officers recognized that even if an initial Allied landing were repelled, reinforcement would follow, and then another. The war in the West was no longer a matter of defeating a single expeditionary force. It was confronting an industrial continuum. Inside planning rooms, maps were adjusted. Atlantic Wall fortifications accelerated. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inspected coastal defenses personally, aware that the scale of potential assault would exceed anything previously attempted in modern warfare. The buildup was no longer abstract intelligence. It was visible infrastructure, airfields, ports, depots, aircraft formations overhead. And as spring 1944 approached, the accumulated weight of that realization pressed toward a decisive moment. Spring 1944. The English coastline shimmered with activity beneath low gray clouds. Convoys had become routine, yet each arrival carried the magnitude of a small army. Troop ships discharged thousands of soldiers, vehicles rumbled inland, and rail lines hummed with armored divisions. Every port operated at maximum capacity, a precise orchestration of men and machines. By March, over 1.5 million American soldiers had arrived in the United Kingdom. Entire corps were positioned along southern England, poised for training and integration. British civilians noted the scale. Streets crowded with trucks, armored carriers, and endless columns of marching troops. Airfields were alive with continuous sorties. Maintenance crews labored day and night, repairing aircraft, servicing tanks, and fueling the growing war machine. For German commanders, reports trickled in through intelligence channels. Reconnaissance flights confirmed the presence of fully equipped divisions. Signals intercepts hinted at coordination between American and British commands. Naval reconnaissance spotted the repeated arrival of troop ships in ports thought secure from large-scale invasion. The Atlantic, once considered a natural barrier, was now a well-used highway carrying vast forces across hostile waters. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel conducted inspections along the Atlantic Wall. He observed fortifications reinforced with mines, anti-tank obstacles, and artillery emplacements. Yet even he could not ignore the reports. The Americans were arriving steadily, in overwhelming numbers. Each division that disembarked represented months of production, coordination, and planning. Each tank or truck added weight to an inevitable offensive. German naval leadership noted the decline in U-boat efficacy. While submarines still patrolled the Atlantic, their numbers were insufficient to halt the tide. Escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft had reduced the mid-ocean air gap, leaving wolf packs vulnerable. Losses mounted. The calculation of risk versus reward shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. By April, the psychological effect was undeniable. Staff officers in Berlin and occupied France debated whether current offensive strategies could withstand the projected buildup. Intelligence reports estimated that more than 2 million American troops would arrive by June with sufficient equipment to launch a major invasion. For planners who had once counted on attrition to slow the United States, the reality was staggering. Meanwhile, American commanders maintained disciplined schedules. Convoys departed on precise rotations. Troop movements were synchronized with supply shipments, artillery units, and air support. The coordination allowed for uninterrupted reinforcement, ensuring that even if a convoy suffered losses, replacement would follow swiftly. The juxtaposition was clear. The United States had transformed a transatlantic passage once fraught with danger into a reliable, reinforced artery. Germany's expectation that the ocean would act as a shield had been nullified. Strategic calculations had to be revised in real time, yet options were limited. Redistributing divisions from the Eastern Front or adjusting U-boat deployment offered only partial mitigation. By early May, American forces were fully integrated into the United Kingdom's logistical network. Assembly areas, staging zones, and training grounds were fully operational. Engineers erected prefabricated bridges and depots. Armor units rehearsed maneuvers. Infantry divisions conducted live-fire exercises under experienced British instructors. Every day added to the cumulative pressure on German command. The Atlantic Bridge had shifted from concept to fact. Germany faced a realization that the sheer scale, discipline, and industrial capacity of the United States rendered attrition tactics insufficient. The numerical and logistical weight of the transatlantic buildup could no longer be ignored. And as May 1944 drew to a close, with over 2 million American troops stationed in Britain, the question was no longer if an invasion would occur. It was when and where it would strike. June 1944 approached with quiet inevitability. The English Channel, a stretch of water that had once seemed a natural obstacle, now lay beneath the watchful eyes of Allied reconnaissance and preparations. Over 2 million American soldiers, alongside British, Canadian, and other Allied forces, were positioned for the largest amphibious operation in history. Every port, airfield, and depot in southern England functioned as a cog in a massive, integrated machine. German command received constant reports. Signals intelligence confirmed convoys arriving almost daily. Aerial reconnaissance observed vehicle columns stretching miles inland from port towns. Intelligence officers tallied divisions, artillery units, and armor. Even the most optimistic calculations could not reconcile the scale of the buildup with previous assumptions about transatlantic limitations. For generals in Berlin, disbelief shifted into alarm. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel intensified inspections along the Atlantic Wall. He moved along the Normandy coast, noting the extensive fortifications, minefields, concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, yet understanding that static defenses could not counter relentless reinforcements arriving across the ocean. For every division positioned to resist a landing, more troops waited just across the channel, ready to follow up or relieve units in combat. The weight of American manpower became tangible, almost oppressive, in strategic calculations. Naval officers faced an unprecedented dilemma. U-boat patrols had diminished impact. Allied escort carriers and long-range aircraft ensured that convoys could move with relatively low attrition. German submarines that had once prowled the Atlantic with lethal effect now risked annihilation. Every sinking achieved by a U-boat was offset by the continuous arrival of fresh troops and equipment. Germany's traditional reliance on attrition to prevent an invasion had failed. American logistics displayed staggering precision. Convoys followed calculated rotations, synchronized with the arrival of supplies. Engineers constructed temporary ports and bridges, ensuring that tanks, artillery, and vehicles could move inland quickly. Airfields facilitated fighter and bomber support for the upcoming offensive. Infantry units conducted large-scale exercises alongside armor columns, rehearsing maneuvers and amphibious coordination. Command structures integrated multiple nations under the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The planning was meticulous, leaving little to chance. The psychological impact on German officers was profound. Reports detailing more than 2.5 million American troops in Britain reached OKW and frontline units alike. Even the most seasoned commanders recognized that repelling a single landing would not end the threat. Reinforcements and supplies would follow almost immediately. Static defenses alone were insufficient. Attrition alone would not delay the inevitable. As June progressed, the cumulative effect became unmistakable. German intelligence, stretched across multiple fronts, struggled to provide accurate assessments. The Atlantic had ceased to function as a barrier. It was now a highway delivering overwhelming numbers directly to the European theater. Every additional division that disembarked increased the operational pressure, forcing German planners to confront a stark reality. The Western Front had become an unstoppable surge, supported by industrial might, technological innovation, and meticulous organization. The stage was set. Troops, supplies, and armor filled southern England, poised for action. German officers understood that the next decisive moment would arrive not through attrition, but through confrontation. The transatlantic buildup, once considered theoretical, had become an unchallengeable reality, an unstoppable flow of manpower and material that would soon collide with fortified positions along the Normandy coast. And from this realization arose the final question echoing through German command. Could the Atlantic highway be resisted? Or had the numerical, logistical, and industrial dominance of the United States sealed the fate of Western Europe? June 6, 1944. The morning fog over Normandy coastline lifted slowly, revealing a horizon lined with thousands of vessels. Dwight D. Eisenhower had coordinated what would become history's largest amphibious assault, D-Day. Every element of the transatlantic buildup was now in motion. Infantry, armored divisions, artillery, and supplies flowed from British ports to the beaches with precision honed over months of preparation. American forces, alongside British and Canadian allies, struck with overwhelming numbers. The Germans, despite reinforced positions along the Atlantic Wall, were caught between concentrated defensive efforts and the unrelenting tide of arriving reinforcements. The U.S. divisions landing on Omaha, Utah, and the other beaches exemplified the discipline, training, and coordination achieved through months of staging in Britain. German commanders were stunned. Reports streamed in describing the scale of forces. Well-equipped divisions, artillery ready within hours, continuous supply of ammunition, tanks, and reinforcements. Every defensive success, every repelled landing attempt, was offset by fresh troops disembarking from ships arriving from across the Channel. The Atlantic, once imagined as a defensive barrier, had become an unstoppable artery sustaining the invasion. Within days, the Allies secured key beachheads. Logistics flowed inland efficiently, facilitated by pontoon bridges, captured ports, and engineers clearing obstacles. American troops moved rapidly to link with British and Canadian units, establishing a solid front. The German defensive strategy, relying on stopping a singular thrust, crumbled under the sheer weight of numbers. Commanders like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel realized that initial tactical victories could no longer compensate for the relentless flow of personnel and equipment arriving daily. Reports from the field described the human toll. German units, often outnumbered and outgunned, struggled to hold positions while facing constant reinforcements. Coastal artillery, previously thought decisive, could not prevent the movement of armored columns inland. Casualties mounted, and the German command faced the stark reality that attrition alone would not halt the American advance. The immediate consequence of the transatlantic buildup was clear. The Atlantic Bridge had delivered not just troops, but operational momentum. Germany's strategic miscalculations and underestimation of American industrial and logistical capacity had left them vulnerable. What had begun as skepticism in Berlin had become a confrontation with an operational reality, one in which the United States could and did sustain an invasion force beyond any previous precedent. By July 1944, the consequences of the transatlantic buildup had become impossible to ignore. The Allies had not only established secure beachheads in Normandy, but had expanded them rapidly, aided by the continuous arrival of American reinforcements. Each day, convoys from Britain delivered fresh divisions, armored vehicles, artillery, and essential supplies. German commanders found themselves confronting a relentless pressure that could not be halted by local counterattacks or strategic maneuvers. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, once confident in the Atlantic Wall's capacity to repel an invasion, reported that the sheer numbers and sustained flow of Allied forces overwhelmed static defenses. German troops were thinly stretched, artillery positions were bypassed, and reserves could not respond quickly enough. Even when counterattacks temporarily slowed the American advance, reinforcements arrived the next day, replenishing losses and sustaining momentum. The operational consequence was clear. Germany's strategic position in Western Europe was collapsing. Divisions previously held in reserve were committed piecemeal to a defense already outmatched in manpower and equipment. Logistics became strained. German supply lines, under constant Allied air interdiction, could not keep pace with the intensity and scale of the Allied offensive. The Atlantic Bridge had not only delivered troops, it had sustained a continuous operational advantage that Germany could not match. On the broader strategic level, the transatlantic buildup had shifted the psychological landscape of the war. German commanders, accustomed to calculating attrition and anticipating logistical limitations, now faced a force sustained by industrial production beyond comprehension. Intelligence assessments revealed that every tactical engagement was immediately backed by new divisions and supplies. The numerical advantage, once theoretical, had become tangible and unstoppable. Beyond Normandy, the implications rippled across the entire Western Front. The continuous flow of American troops and material allowed the Allies to launch subsequent operations with confidence, ultimately liberating France and pushing into Belgium and the Netherlands. Germany's capacity to respond was chronically impaired. Meanwhile, the Soviet advance on the Eastern Front compounded strategic pressure, forcing Germany to fight a war on multiple fronts with dwindling resources. Reports from surviving German commanders highlighted the scale of their realization. Operational directives noted, the enemy's logistical capability exceeds all previous calculations. Attrition tactics are insufficient. The threat is continuous. High-ranking officers acknowledged that, regardless of individual battlefield successes, the strategic advantage had shifted irreversibly. The Atlantic was no longer a barrier. It was a conduit for inexorable Allied dominance. By the end of 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a new phase. German forces were reacting to events rather than shaping them. The industrial and logistical supremacy of the United States manifested through the transatlantic movement of over 2.5 million troops had created a decisive operational reality. Germany's hope for a single decisive defensive engagement had vanished. The flow of men and material had ensured that the Allied initiative would remain permanent. The transatlantic buildup was more than a numerical achievement. It was a strategic turning point. It transformed the Atlantic from an obstacle into a strategic highway, rendering previous assumptions about Germany's ability to defend Western Europe obsolete. The story of over 2.5 million American troops crossing the Atlantic is not merely one of logistics or numbers. It is a testament to the transformation of modern warfare, where industrial capacity, organization, and sustained coordination became as decisive as battlefield tactics. The Atlantic, once a natural barrier to invasion, became an artery through which the United States projected power across thousands of miles of contested ocean. For Germany, the realization was profound and unsettling. Commanders who had built strategies around attrition, surprise, and limited Allied mobility faced a reality that defied traditional military logic. The scale and continuity of the American buildup undermined the very assumptions on which defensive doctrines had been based. Even the most fortified positions along the Atlantic Wall could not compensate for the unending flow of men, vehicles, and supplies arriving day after day. From the American perspective, the achievement was extraordinary in its precision and execution. Troops trained, shipped, and staged with meticulous timing. Convoys moved under threat of attack, yet disciplined procedures ensured minimal disruption. The industrial engine that powered these movements, the shipyards, factories, and production lines, was a force as formidable as any army. It exemplified the principle that wars could be won not only on the battlefield, but through organization, planning, and sustained effort behind the front lines. This moment in history also underscores the evolution of warfare itself. Success no longer depended solely on tactical genius or temporary advantage. It depended on endurance, adaptability, and the ability to leverage national capacity over time. The Atlantic Bridge demonstrated that logistical mastery could shape the course of conflict before a single shot was fired on land. Ultimately, the transatlantic movement of American forces reshaped the war in Western Europe. It established a permanent advantage for the Allies, enabling subsequent operations from Normandy to the liberation of Paris and beyond. For Germany, it was the beginning of an unrelenting strategic decline, a humbling reminder that modern warfare favored those who could combine production, organization, and operational execution at a scale never before seen. The crossing of the Atlantic was more than a military maneuver. It was a decisive statement about the nature of industrial age war. It marked a moment when sheer organizational power, executed with discipline and foresight, became an unstoppable force, reshaping history in its wake.